And welcome into the roundtable, where we'll keep things on the ocean, and hopefully we won't have a situation like that to deal with. Bill Priestley here with you, and we're going to talk a little bit about maritime shipping and the situation that they find themselves in at this particular point in a couple of different areas as well. Joining us to talk about it, we've got Dr. Sal Mercogliano, who joins us as an associate professor of history at Campbell University, and then the maritime professor, Lauren Beegan, also joining us from Boston, Massachusetts. Guys, thanks so much for joining us here for this discussion. And we want to talk about the main story that came out late yesterday, which of course was Bed Bath & Beyond going very interestingly up against OOCL in trying to either recur damages or pick up somewhere around $31 million in that respective thing. They put their suit down about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and OOCL came back yesterday with their response. Lauren, you had a chance to look at those, and this is a very interesting case, and maybe one that might get to a judgment before any others in this kind of detail.
Sure. So so the parties involved are Bed Bath & Beyond, which notably filed for bankruptcy just a few weeks ago. So this was interesting to see it hit the complaints process, and they're filing suit against OOCL. So that's Orient Overseas Container Line, which is a member of the Ocean Alliance. But interesting about OOCL, just notable, they are a controlled carrier, meaning that they are majority owned or controlled by a foreign government. So they're not allowed to drop their rates on less than 30 days notice. Just a little anecdote for the side. But this is a really interesting case because it hinges on minimum quantity commitments and whether the FMC has that jurisdiction. And like you said, we might see a determination on jurisdiction earlier than we otherwise would. Typically, cases at the FMC can take a year or more to go through. But sometimes when it hinges on jurisdictional questions, they're going to answer that question early just to say, we do have jurisdiction. We will be reviewing this.
Yeah, Sal, looking at this from the FMC perspective, what do you think they're going to call in terms of do they have the right to rule on this sort of a case?
Well, I mean, it's interesting to see how Bed Bath & Beyond and OOCL are looking at this. OOCL has come out and basically argued, going back to the Shipping Act of 1916 and running through the 1984 and the 1998 iterations, saying that there is no jurisdiction that the FMC has on this, that they have basically lost that jurisdiction. And that, I think, is the interesting argument here. We just saw yesterday in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, Dusty Johnson's new proposed ocean shipping reform Act coming through, and which would empower the FMC with more authority. As a matter of fact, Representative Garamendi made the point of discussing the fact that the FMC needs the ability to be able to make judgments, much like other regulatory bodies can, without it having to go to court. So I think OOCL is really one of the very first carriers we're seeing throwing the gauntlet down to really test the powers of the Federal Maritime Commission under the current laws right now. And again, what we're in is a period of flux here with how laws are changing and evolving.
Lauren, there's no precedent for this, right? I mean, this is the first kind of case where we've seen a retailer sue a shipper in this sort of, or a carrier, excuse me, in this sort of way.
Well, so we've seen some attempts, and certainly with COVID and all of the craziness that was happening with COVID, these are a novel series of cases coming through. The other attempt that I'm talking about is the MCS versus MSC case, which is still kind of in like a legal procedural gray zone. It's being kind of finessed out on legal procedure. Like I said, it's stuck in discovery. That was another case on the minimum quantity commitments, which talks about how many TEUs or FEUs, basically how many boxes the two parties are going to be agreeing to in their service contract, which is filed with the FMC. Whether that is a term that can now be a breach of contract. And so if it's a breach of contract, it usually gets kicked out of the FMC for not being part of their jurisdiction, and that's what OOCL is arguing here. But what MCS and what Bed Bath & Beyond are arguing here is that this is a service contract violation or something along the lines of a Shipping Act violation, which would then keep it in the FMC. So that is where the novelty comes, is this a service contract violation, and is that enforceable? And so that's going to be really novel, along with the jurisdictional questions that Dr. Sal Mercogliano just mentioned.
Sal, let me go back to you just a little bit on that respect. If moving past jurisdiction in terms of who has the ability to rule on this kind of case, if Bed Bath & Beyond were successful in this, how does that change things for carriers, knowing that they're now type of legislation or even court battles?
So, I mean, one of the running jokes in ocean shipping is shipping agreements are worth the fax paper they're printed on, and you can basically toss them out. And this is really raising that question: is whether or not that OOCL had to honor their agreement in the past. And let's be clear, it's gone both ways. Both shipper and carrier have broken these agreements to go get better rates and better agreements at time. But now you have the FMC intervening here and saying, okay, you have to honor this. And what's more important is Bed Bath & Beyond is going beyond the point here and basically arguing that their bankruptcy is in the hands of OOCL, a Hong Kong-based shipping firm that, as Lauren mentioned, is basically state-owned. And so, I mean, this has the potential not just for jurisdiction on a bankruptcy case, but also whether or not a foreign government had a role in the bankruptcy of a U.S. corporation. So this has a myriad of potential problems here. I do have a question about the total amount being involved here and whether or not Bed Bath & Beyond really has the stature to sit there and say the bankruptcy was caused by this. Because, again, that amount, which is in several $1 million here, may not be just enough to justify the bankruptcy. The question here is what other issues were underlying the bankruptcy.
Yeah, Lauren, just to wrap this up, in terms of, I mean, obviously, does the bankruptcy make this even more of an argument for Bed Bath & Beyond, the fact that it looks like this may have contributed to the company's ultimate demise? Or at least going into bankruptcy. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, perhaps. But really, I mean, bankruptcy is not part of the Shipping Act, right? And so the FMC is very, very kind of keenly interested in Shipping Act violations. There is a sister case being brought that's in the $1.something billion range that's in the Southern District of New York. So that is probably going to be a little bit more of a breach of contract. So they're almost kind of understanding and saying that we see the FMC is the Service Contract Shipping Act violation, but that's not to say we didn't actually have a breach of contract violation, and they're preemptively putting that outside of the FMC. This is going to be really interesting to see how it comes out. I think both sides have appropriately and maybe expectedly laid out their arguments of what you would expect to the arguments to be, and we'll just see how the FMC takes it. This is going to be a marquee case in that it will probably provide some clarity in the otherwise gray area of these service contracts.
It's going to be interesting to follow there as well. So switching from the courtroom to the negotiating table, there's a subject that we haven't talked about very much is the ILWU and the situation that they are in at this point right now out west with their negotiations. We're coming up on, I think, we're 5 weeks away from a year past the deadline that they were looking at to trying to getting a deal done. And we had a roundtable not too long ago about this subject and others in terms of labor negotiations. And both of our guests said that the ILWU certainly has missed the mark in terms of getting the best deal they possibly could. Sal, as you look at this situation, again, 50 weeks separated from a possible deadline that could have been a year ago. What do you know, and what should we expect as this seems to be straight?
Yeah, I'm hearing from a lot of people who are involved in these negotiations, and it seems like they're making way. And this would have been really nice a year ago to be at this point where they're at. But at the same time, we're also learning about potential hurdles coming in here, and they still have the base issues that are out there. And the fundamental base issue is going to be this automation issue. Is the union, the ILWU, wants to ensure that its workers have employment, and most importantly, its retirees have the background to be able to get their retirement. Whereas the PMA is still dealing with the issue that the latest slate of reports came in showing productivity of ports around the world. And, thank God LA and Long Beach aren't at the bottom anymore. They're just 5 or 6 from the bottom anymore. So they really haven't progressed. But at the same time, we're seeing cargo shift back to the West Coast a little bit. And I think one of the things we're seeing is carriers are basically diversifying where their cargo is coming in. If I was Los Angeles, Long Beach, and the West Coast ports, I wouldn't be popping champagne over this yet, because at any moment these talks can break down. And literally, I'm not sure the union has anything left to lose at this point to really creating work stoppages at this, in this area.
Lauren, when you look at the situation, what stands out to you is certainly from a legal perspective, but just trying to get this deal done so that we can return to quote unquote normal, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, the longer it goes, if challenges come up, it's what kind of rules the discussion, what rules the partnership here. Without this contract in place, without any contract in place, you could say, well, maybe the old contract is flowing over, but it leaves you in this legal gray area as well, and we don't really love being in legal gray areas. So I'm hopeful that this really does get solved quickly. But as Sal said, that it's probably just as stressed as it's always been, but there are some glimmers of light coming through. So hopefully it'll start moving along, but I don't know. It's hard to say.
How much, Sal, have you heard from what you've heard from various sources? I mean, is there reason to be very optimistic, or is there reason to be very pessimistic in terms of the optimism, as most people like to say, hey, it looks good, when in fact it looks like terrible?
Well, I mean, they're talking and they're hammering out the agreements, and there's a lot of facets to this. Again, you're dealing with 28 ports, you're dealing with a lot of moving parts here. And so the good thing is they're making that progress. Again, you have to go back to the issue is, would they have been in a better position to negotiate this a year ago versus right now? And I think that's the other element here. Who's in favor of prolonging this longer? Is it labor? Is it the PMA? Who's going to get the better deal here? And the problem you have here is always the sword of Damocles, that if one side or the other throws up a roadblock, what happens to that disruption on the West Coast? Do we go back to 2014, 2015? Now, there are different factors at play here. We see cargo moving differently. We got cargo moving through the Panama Canal, but Panama Canal just announced they got really low water levels right now, and they may have to curtail the amount of ships and cargo coming through the Panama Canal. So does that put West Coast labor back in the driver's seat? There's so many factors here. It's really hard to see. All we know is they need to come up with an agreement sooner rather than later.
Always changes month to month, season to season, and obviously, hopefully we see an agreement in the not too distant future. Sal and Lauren, thanks so much for joining us. Always great to talk to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Great to be here.
All right, we will take a short break and come back and wrap up this edition of Freightwaves Now after this.